It was a regular Tuesday evening when I found the postcard. Nothing about the day hinted at the storm it would unleash, nothing about my wife's usual routine seemed off, until I saw it. A small, glossy card, tucked between the stack of bills and advertisements on the kitchen counter. The front showed a serene image of mountains, a lake in the foreground, and the fading orange hues of the setting sun. But it wasn't the image that caught my attention. It was the handwritten note on the back. "Thank you for an unforgettable weekend, Erik." My heart skipped a beat. Erik. The name felt familiar, like a ghost from the past, but I couldn't place it. I flipped the card over, studying it again, searching for some clue, some explanation. Nothing. Just those 8 words, dancing mockingly in front of me. I sat down at the table, the postcard still in my hand, trying to make sense of it. Lana had just come back from a weekend getaway in the mountains, some kind of reset trip to clear her mind from the stress of city life. She said it was something she needed, a chance to be alone, to reconnect with herself. I had no reason to question it. After all, we'd been married for years, and though things hadn't been perfect lately, I trusted her. Or at least, I thought I did. But now, as I held this card, I realized something had shifted in her. The distance between us had grown more pronounced in the past few months. Lana had been more distracted, her smiles forced, her late-night work calls becoming more frequent. At first, I brushed it off as her being overwhelmed. She had a demanding job, after all. But now, with this postcard in my hand, everything seemed different. I tried to push down the sickening feeling rising in my chest. It couldn't be what I thought. There had to be an explanation. Maybe this, Erik, was someone she met on her trip, just a tour guide or a fellow traveler. Maybe unforgettable didn't mean what my mind was conjuring. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Lana walked into the kitchen just as I tucked the card back into the pile of mail. I watched her, waiting for some sign, some flicker of guilt or discomfort. But she moved about the room as if nothing was out of place, smiling as she asked how my day had been. The ease in her voice only made my suspicion grow. "It was fine," I said, trying to sound casual. "Anything interesting happen on your trip?" She paused for a moment, as if weighing her words, then shrugged. "Not really. Just a lot of hiking and some reading. The view from the cabin was amazing, though." Her answer seemed rehearsed. Too perfect. I didn't press further. Not yet. But as she turned to leave the kitchen, I caught her looking at her phone, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. The knot in my stomach tightened. I had to find out who this Erik was, and what exactly had made that weekend so unforgettable. The days after I found the postcard felt like I was living in someone else's life. Everything seemed the same on the surface. Lana and I still shared meals, still had the same routines, but underneath, there was something festering, a suspicion, a doubt, that wouldn't leave me alone. Lana continued to act as though nothing had changed. She went about her days, smiling, laughing when necessary, but there was something artificial about it now. Her late nights became more frequent. "Work's just crazy right now," she'd say, her eyes darting away when I'd ask why she wasn't coming home until after midnight. I wanted to believe her, wanted to trust her, but that card wouldn't let me. Every time she left the house, a piece of me wondered if she was really going where she said she was. I tried to shake the feeling. I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the growing paranoia. But it was no use. The silence of our home when she wasn't there only amplified the questions in my mind. Who was Erik? Why had she kept that card? Why had she never mentioned him? One night, I decided to confront her, gently, not directly, but enough to see her reaction. We were sitting on the couch, watching some mindless show we both pretended to enjoy. She seemed relaxed, sipping on a glass of wine. "So, that trip you took," I started, trying to keep my voice casual. "Did you meet anyone interesting?" She barely looked at me, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Not really," she said with a shrug. "It was mostly just me and the nature. Peaceful." I nodded, though her answer didn't sit right with me. "I found this postcard," I said, as casually as I could. "From someone named Erik." "Who's that?" Her body stiffened for a moment, just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. I saw it, the hesitation, the slight flicker of guilt. But she recovered quickly, giving me a puzzled smile. "Oh, he was just the guide. He took me on one of the hikes." I must have forgotten to mention him. Just the guide. The words echoed in my head. I wanted to believe her, but the way she said it, too quick, too dismissive, only deepened my suspicion. As the days wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lana was lying to me. There was something she wasn't telling me. Something that went beyond that postcard. And the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that Erik wasn't just some random guide. One evening, after Lana had left for another one of her late-night work meetings, I decided to go through some old things. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe some proof that I was wrong, that this was all in my head. But instead, I found something that made my blood run cold. Buried in the back of a drawer in our office was an old photo album. One I hadn't looked through in years. I flipped through the pages, reminiscing on the early days of our relationship. And then I saw it. A picture of me, standing next to a man, both of us smiling, arms slung around each other's shoulders. The man was Erik. He hadn't just been Lana's guide. He had been my friend, years ago, back when things were different. We had lost touch after a falling out, something about a business deal gone wrong, and I hadn't thought about him in years. But now, here he was, back in my life in the worst way possible. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some affair. This was a betrayal on a level one hadn't even imagined. Lana hadn't just cheated on me with some stranger. She had chosen someone who had once been close to me, someone who knew me. I stared at the photo, my hands shaking. There was no way this was a coincidence. She had to have known who he was. The discovery that Erik was more than just a guide haunted me for days. I could hardly look at Lana without picturing the two of them together, her with my old friend, hiding this betrayal behind her familiar smile. My mind spun with questions, accusations, and worst of all, the realization that she knew who Erik was all along. She had to have known. That thought alone twisted the knife deeper into my gut. I couldn't let it go on. I needed answers, and I needed them now. That evening, I decided to confront her directly. I waited for her to come home from yet another, late meeting. The clock in the living room ticked loudly, each minute dragging by as I rehearsed what I would say. My anger was simmering, barely contained. When the door finally clicked open, I was ready. "Lana," I called, my voice tight. She stepped into the living room, clearly surprised by the tone of my voice. Her expression wavered between concern and confusion. "Art, what's wrong?" she asked, taking off her coat. There was an innocence in her eyes, but I wasn't buying it anymore. I stood up, hands clenched at my sides. "Sit down," I said, the words coming out more harshly than I'd intended. Lana blinked but complied, sitting down on the edge of the couch. For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to decide how to start, how to unravel the lies she'd woven around us. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old photo I had found, tossing it onto the coffee table in front of her. "Recognize him?" I asked, my voice cold. She hesitated before glancing down at the picture. Her face paled. "Art, don't lie to me," I cut her off, my voice rising. "You knew exactly who Erik was. You've known this whole time. What the hell were you thinking?" Lana's mouth opened, then closed. She looked away, guilt spreading across her features. I didn't plan it, Art. It just happened." "Didn't plan it? So what? You just happened to run into my old friend, and then what? You accidentally started sleeping with him?" My voice was shaking now, fury barely held in check. Lana finally looked at me, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know it was him at first, I swear. I needed something, Art. Something that I wasn't getting here. It's not an excuse, but something you weren't getting here?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You've got everything, Lana. A home, a husband who loves you." "I know," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "I know, and I'm sorry. But I felt like I was suffocating here. Everything was so routine, so predictable. And then I met him again, and it was like I could breathe for the first time in years." Her words cut deep, but I refused to show it. I leaned forward, glaring at her. "And that justifies betraying me? With someone I once called a friend?" Lana's face crumpled, and she covered her face with her hands. "I never wanted to hurt you, Art. I didn't know what else to do. I was lost." I stood up, unable to sit any longer. "Lost? No, Lana. You knew exactly what you were doing. You chose this. You chose him." She sobbed quietly into her hands, but I couldn't find it in myself to comfort her. "Not now. Not after everything. We're not done," I said, walking toward the door. "But right now, I can't even look at you." I grabbed my coat and left the house, slamming the door behind me. The night air was cold, biting into my skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy rage coursing through me. I didn't go far, just far enough to clear my head, to keep from saying something I couldn't take back. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The streetlights outside blurred as I stared straight ahead, my mind spinning. How long had this been going on? How many times had they met behind my back? And why Erik? Of all the people in the world, why did it have to be him? It was almost ironic, really. The man I once trusted, the man who had been part of my life for years, now sneaking around with my wife. I should have seen it coming, should have known that someone like Erik, charming, reckless, always pushing boundaries, wouldn't hesitate to cross the line if given the chance. I sat there for what felt like hours, the engine humming softly beneath me, before a thought began to take shape. This wasn't just about Lana anymore. This was about both of them. They had both betrayed me, and I wasn't going to let them walk away from this without consequences. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the adrenaline racing through my veins. I wasn't going to let this destroy me. No, I'd turn the tables. I'd take control of this situation, make them pay for what they'd done. But it had to be done carefully. I couldn't just explode in anger. No, that would only give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. No, I'd play it smart. I'd get close to Erik, make him think everything was fine. Then, when the moment was right, I'd strike. He wouldn't see it coming. I took out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found his number. I hadn't spoken to him in years. But I knew he'd answer. He always did. I pressed the call button, my heart pounding in my chest. The line rang once, twice, and then he picked up. Art? Wow, man, it's been a long time. How's it going? Hearing his voice made my stomach turn, but I forced myself to stay calm. Hey, Erik. Yeah, it's been a while. Listen, I was thinking, maybe we should catch up. Grab a drink sometime, talk about old times. There was a brief pause on the other end, then his familiar laugh. Sure thing, man, I'm always down for a drink. When are you free? How about this weekend? I suggested, my voice steady. We can meet up at the Rusty Nail. Say, Saturday evening? Sounds perfect, Erik replied, oblivious to the tension in my voice. See you then. I hung up, my hands trembling as I placed the phone down. Step 1 of the plan was in motion. Now all I had to do was wait. The days leading up to Saturday were a blur. Every time I looked at Lana, all I saw was her with him, laughing, touching, sharing secrets. She didn't mention our confrontation again, and I didn't push it. There was no point. She'd already made her choice. But I was about to make mine. Saturday came faster than I expected, and by the time evening rolled around, I was ready. I'd spent the day rehearsing what I would say, how I would act. I needed Erik to believe that I wasn't onto him, that I was just another old friend looking to catch up. The Rusty Nail was a small, dimly lit bar on the edge of town. A perfect place for a quiet meeting, away from prying eyes. When I walked in, Erik was already there, sitting at a table near the back, a beer in hand. Art, he called out when he saw me, standing up to give me a handshake. Man, it's good to see you. Good to see you too, I said, forcing a smile as I sat down across from him. It's been too long. For the next hour, we talked about everything but the elephant in the room. Old memories, shared friends, even a few jokes. Erik seemed relaxed, like nothing was out of the ordinary. It was almost impressive, how easily he could lie to my face. But I wasn't here for small talk. The longer I sat across from Erik, the harder it became to keep the mask on. Every laugh he let out, every casual remark about the good old days, made my skin crawl. It wasn't the Erik the first remembered. This was someone else entirely, someone who could betray without hesitation and carry on like nothing had happened. As I listened to him talk about his life, his travels, and his job, I couldn't help but wonder if he was recounting the same stories to Lana in those secret moments they shared. I sipped my beer slowly, keeping my gaze steady, though inside I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. I had to play it smart, keep the conversation going just long enough to lower his guard. But the rage was building, and it was getting harder to suppress. So, I finally said, leaning back in my chair, what have you been up to lately, man? Anything exciting? Erik grinned, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. Same old, same old. Work's been keeping me busy, but I can't complain. Got a couple of projects lined up. Life's been good, you know? I nodded, pretending to be interested. And outside of work? Anything special going on? His eyes flickered for just a second, but it was enough. He shifted in his seat slightly, his casual demeanor faltering for a brief moment. Nah, nothing too special. You know how it is. Just trying to keep things simple. Quote. My jaw clenched, but I kept my tone light. Simple, huh? Is that what they call it now? I smirked, a cold edge creeping into my voice. Erik raised an eyebrow, but he still didn't catch on. What do you mean? I leaned forward, lowering my voice slightly. You know, running into old friends, taking private tours, keeping things simple. For a split second, I saw the realization flicker across his face. He knew. He knew exactly what I was talking about, and for the first time that evening. He looked uneasy. Art, man, what are you getting at? His voice was still trying to sound casual, but the nervousness in his eyes was undeniable. I stared him down, my grip tightening around the glass in my hand. I'm talking about Lana. His face drained of color, the mask of nonchalance slipping away completely. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was caught, and he knew it. You think I didn't know? I continued, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. You think you could just waltz back into my life and take what's mine without any consequences? Art, I swear, he started, but I cut him off. Don't. I slammed the glass down on the table, the sound echoing in the small bar. Don't insult me by pretending this was just some mistake. You knew exactly what you were doing. And you thought I wouldn't find out? Erik swallowed hard, his hands clenching and unclenching on the table. It wasn't like that, I swear. It happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Go this far? I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. You slept with my wife. Erik, that's about as far as it gets. He looked down at the table, guilt and shame written all over his face, but I wasn't about to let him off the hook that easily. I had spent too many nights replaying every detail in my head, too much time seething over the betrayal. This wasn't going to end with a simple apology. I trusted you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You were my friend, and you threw it all away for what? A few stolen moments? Erik looked up at me, his expression filled with regret. I'm sorry, Art, I really am. I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to hurt me? I stood up abruptly, leaning over the table so that my face was inches from his. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you went behind my back. He didn't say anything, just sat there, looking like a man who knew he was about to lose everything. I'm not done with you yet, I said coldly. You're going to pay for what you've done. I turned and walked out of the bar, leaving him sitting there in stunned silence. The door slammed shut behind me, but the rage inside me was far from gone. This was just the beginning. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with thoughts of revenge. Erik's pathetic apology did nothing to quench the fury burning inside me. I needed to do more than confront him. I needed to destroy him, to make him feel the way I felt. But it wasn't just about Erik. Lana, too, had played her part in this betrayal. She'd lied to me, betrayed me, and I couldn't let her get away with it. As I sat in the dark living room, staring at the shadows on the wall, a plan began to form in my mind. It would take time, patience, and precision, but when it was done, they would both regret ever crossing me. The next morning, Lana acted like everything was normal, like she hadn't torn our lives apart. She moved around the house with the same ease, the same casual routine. But I could see the cracks. There was a nervousness in her actions, a tension in the way she glanced at me when she thought I wasn't looking. I decided to play along for now, to give her a false sense of security. It was the only way to keep her off guard. Over breakfast, I made small talk, pretending to be my usual self. What are your plans for the day? I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. Just heading to the office. Got some meetings to catch up on. Busy week, huh? I said, sipping my coffee, my voice neutral. Yeah, it's been a bit crazy. She looked down at her plate, avoiding my gaze. But I'll manage. I nodded, forcing a smile. Well, don't work too hard. She smiled back, but it didn't reach her eyes. The tension was palpable, and I knew she was feeling the weight of her secret. Good. Let her squirm. Once she left for work, I got to work myself. I had a few connections that I could use, people who owed me favors. It was time to start setting the pieces in motion. I spent the rest of the day making calls, gathering information, and planning my next move. By the time Lana came home that evening, I had everything I needed. But I didn't show my hand just yet. I greeted her with the same forced normalcy, acting as if nothing had changed. We ate dinner together, watching TV afterward like we always did, but inside, I was calculating every step. As the days passed, the tension between us grew thicker, though Lana still pretended that everything was fine. But I knew better. I watched her closely, every subtle movement, every hesitation. She was hiding something, and I was going to uncover it. One evening, after another day of pretending, Lana came home looking more stressed than usual. She dropped her bag by the door and sighed heavily as she walked into the living room where I was sitting, scrolling through my phone. "Tough day?" I asked, glancing up at her. She nodded, rubbing her temples. "Yeah, just, work's been insane lately." I watched her carefully, noting the way she avoided eye contact. "Anything you want to talk about?" She shook her head. "No, it's just a lot on my plate right now." I could sense her anxiety building, the weight of her lies starting to take its toll. She was unraveling, slowly but surely. And it was exactly what I wanted. "Well, if you need anything, let me know," I said, offering her a warm smile, though inside I was anything but calm. "Thanks," she muttered, sinking onto the couch beside me. We sat there in silence for a while, the only sound being the soft hum of the television. The distance between us was growing wider by the day, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. I decided it was time to push her a little further. "You've been working a lot lately. Are you sure everything's okay at the office?" She looked at me sharply, her eyes widening just for a second before she composed herself. "Yeah, it's fine. Just busy." I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But I could see the cracks in her facade. She was lying, and soon enough, I would have the proof I needed. Over the next few days, I kept up the act, playing the part of the oblivious husband while secretly gathering more information. The pieces were falling into place, and soon, the truth would be out in the open. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 1,000 times, imagining how it would play out. The scenario was simple: Lana's lies were unraveling, and tonight, I would rip away the last shred of her deception. For days, I'd kept my cool, maintained a facade of ignorance, while beneath the surface, I was simmering. The day of reckoning had finally come. Lana came home late again, her usual excuse ready before I even asked. "Sorry, work's just been, overwhelming," she said, her voice tinged with the same false exhaustion I'd grown accustomed to. I stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta, pretending not to notice how she wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's okay," I replied casually. "Dinner's almost ready. I figured you'd be hungry." She looked surprised for a moment, like she didn't expect me to care. "That's sweet of you," she muttered, setting her bag down by the door. "Yeah, well, I thought we could use a quiet night," I said, forcing a smile. "We haven't had one of those in a while, right?" "Yeah," she agreed, sitting at the table. "It's been hectic." I ladled the pasta onto plates and brought them to the table. The silence between us was thick, heavy with unspoken tension. She was chewing her food, but I could tell she wasn't really tasting it. Her mind was elsewhere, probably on Erik, if I had to guess. "So," I said, breaking the quiet, "do you remember the last time we had dinner with Erik?" Lana stiffened, her fork freezing midair. Yeah, it's been a while." I nodded, watching her closely. "Yeah, funny how that works. Time flies when you're busy, doesn't it?" Her eyes darted to mine, a flicker of panic flashing across her face. "What do you mean?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest. "I mean, you seem to have been busy with more than just work lately." Her fork clattered onto her plate, and she stared at me, wide-eyed. "Art, what are you talking about?" "You and Erik," I said, my voice steady but cold. "I know about the two of you." For a moment, she didn't say anything. Her face went pale, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The guilt was written all over her features. She didn't need to admit it, I already knew. "How long?" I asked, my voice sharper now. "How long have you been lying to me?" "Art, I can explain," she stammered, but I cut her off. Don't insult me by pretending this was some innocent mistake." Her hands trembled as she reached for her water glass. It wasn't supposed to happen. I didn't mean for it to go this far." I laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Not supposed to happen? So, what, you just accidentally fell into bed with him?" She flinched, the words hitting her like a slap. I didn't want to hurt you." I shook my head, disgusted. "Well, you failed. You did hurt me. And for what?" For him? It wasn't about him, she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. It was just. I felt so lost, Art. You were always so distant, so focused on your own things. I needed something, and Erik, he was just there. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. So, this is my fault? You cheated because I was too distant. You betrayed me, Lana. You destroyed us. She sobbed quietly, her head in her hands. But I didn't feel any sympathy. Not anymore. Lana's tears did nothing to move me. I had heard enough excuses, enough justifications. Nothing she could say would undo the damage. And I had no interest in playing the role of the forgiving husband. How long has this been going on? I demanded, my voice icy. She wiped her eyes with trembling hands, her gaze fixed on the table. A few months, she whispered. It started after the trip to the mountains. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. So, it was exactly as I had suspected. That damn weekend getaway had been the beginning of the end. A few months? I repeated, my voice rising. And what? You just thought I wouldn't notice? You thought you could keep sneaking around behind my back? Lana shook her head, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I didn't know how to stop. I didn't mean for it to get this far. You didn't mean for it to get this far, I echoed mockingly. But it did, Lana. You made a choice. You chose him over me. She lifted her tear-streaked face to look at me, her eyes pleading. I didn't choose him over you. I just felt so empty. And with Erik, it was like I could escape everything. Just for a little while. I scoffed, turning away from her. So, what now? Am I supposed to forgive you? Pretend like this never happened? No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't know what to do. I stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her betrayal hanging heavy between us. Part of me wanted to scream, to yell, to throw everything in her face. But another part of me just felt empty. Numb. You don't know what to do? I finally said, my voice low and steady. Well, I do. We're done, Lana. Her sobbing grew louder, her body shaking with the force of it. Art, please, don't say that. We can fix this. We can. There's no fixing this, I interrupted coldly. You made your choice. Now, you have to live with the consequences. She reached out for me, but I stepped back, avoiding her touch. Don't even try. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a sense of finality, a strange sense of peace. It was over. Whatever we had, whatever we'd built, it was gone. I left the house that night, needing space, needing air. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating me. I drove aimlessly for hours, my thoughts a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and betrayal. How had it come to this? How had the woman I'd loved for so many years become a stranger, someone who could hurt me so deeply? And Erik, my so-called friend, how could he have done this to me? But as the night wore on, my thoughts became clearer. I knew what I needed to do. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. I wasn't going to let them walk away unscathed. The next morning, I returned home, finding Lana sitting on the couch, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes filled with hope that maybe, just maybe, I had changed my mind. But I hadn't. I'm leaving, I said flatly, my voice devoid of emotion. Her face crumpled, and she stood up, rushing toward me. Art, no, please. I held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. It's too late, Lana. You made your choice. Now, I'm making mine. She stood there, frozen, tears streaming down her face, as I turned and walked out the door. I didn't look back. As I drove away, I felt a sense of liberation wash over me. I was done playing the victim, done pretending that things could ever go back to the way they were. Lana and Erik would have to live with the choices they'd made. And I would start over. Without them. But even as I left the past behind, I knew that the story wasn't over. There was still one final reckoning left. Erik would pay. One way or another, he would know the full extent of the damage he'd caused. And I wasn't going to rest until he did. I spent days planning, rehearsing every move in my mind, thinking of how I could make Erik pay. Simply walking away wasn't enough for me. Lana had destroyed our marriage, but Erik, he had betrayed me on a different level. He wasn't just some stranger, he was a man I once trusted. I wasn't going to let him get away with that. The first step was finding him. I knew he wouldn't be hard to track down. He lived a few towns over, in a small place not far from where he and Lana had their little mountain getaway. That fact alone fueled my rage. I pulled up outside his house one evening, sitting in my car, watching. The house was dark. The windows were closed, curtains drawn, as if he was hiding from the world. Good, I thought. He should be hiding from me. I didn't knock. I wasn't here for a conversation. I went around the side of the house, knowing the layout well enough. We had been friends once, after all. I knew his habits, where he kept his spare key. It was under the flower pot, exactly where I remembered it being. Inside, the house was cold, silent. It didn't take long to find him. He was sitting in his living room, a beer in his hand, staring at the television. His back was to me, and he didn't even notice when I stepped in. Nice night for a drink. Isn't it? I said, my voice calm but dripping with menace. Erik jumped, nearly dropping his beer. He turned to face me, his eyes wide with shock. Art? What the hell? You didn't think I'd come? I asked, stepping closer. You thought you could just disappear, after everything you did? He stood up, his face pale. Art, listen. No, you listen, I snapped, cutting him off. You ruined everything. You betrayed me, stabbed me in the back. And now you think you can just hide here, like nothing happened? Look, I know what I did was wrong, he started, his voice trembling slightly. But Lana, it wasn't planned. It just happened. I laughed, a cold, bitter sound. Just happened? Like you just accidentally ended up in bed with my wife? He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. I lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. You destroyed my life, Erik, I growled. And I'm going to make damn sure you regret it. His eyes were wide with fear now. Art, please. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to go this far. I tightened my grip on his shirt, my voice low and dangerous. It's too late for apologies. I left Erik's house that night, my hands shaking, adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The look on his face as I'd left him slumped against the wall, beaten and bruised, gave me no satisfaction. I had thought that seeing him suffer would ease the burning anger inside me, but it hadn't. If anything, I felt emptier than before. Revenge wasn't supposed to feel like this. I drove home in a haze, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Lana had called me several times while I was gone, but I hadn't answered. I wasn't ready to deal with her yet. Not until I figured out what my next move would be. When I finally walked through the front door, the house was quiet. Lana was sitting on the couch, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up at me as I entered, her eyes filled with worry. Where were you? She asked softly, her voice trembling. Out, I replied coldly, not offering her any more than that. Art, please, we need to talk. I stood there for a moment, just staring at her. The woman I had loved, the woman I had married, now seemed like a stranger to me. I didn't even know who she was anymore. How could she have done this to me? How could she have betrayed everything we had built together? There's nothing to talk about, I said finally, my voice hollow. It's over, Lana. You and me. It's done. Quote. Her eyes filled with tears again, and she shook her head. No, it's not. We can still fix this, Art. We can. You slept with my friend, I interrupted, my voice cold and hard. You lied to me, over and over again. How am I supposed to forgive that? I made a mistake, she whispered, her voice breaking. I know I did, but I still love you, Art. I always have. I laughed bitterly. Love? Is that what you call this? You called cheating on me with another man, love. I was lost, she said, tears streaming down her face. I didn't know what I was doing. But I never stopped loving you. Please, Art, don't give up on us. I stood there, staring at her, my heart torn in two. Part of me wanted to believe her, wanted to take her back and pretend like none of this had ever happened. But the other part of me, the part that had been shattered by her betrayal, couldn't let go of the pain. I don't know if I can do that, I said finally, my voice barely a whisper. She reached out for me, her hand trembling. Please, Art, I need you. We can make this work. We can rebuild. I looked down at her hand, so close, yet so far away. I wanted to reach out and take it, to pull her into my arms and tell her that everything would be okay. But I couldn't. The wound was too deep, the pain too raw. I need some time, I said, turning away from her. I need to think. The days that followed were a blur, the kind of numb haze that settles over you when you don't know where to go, don't know what to feel. The house felt colder, emptier. Lana and I barely exchanged words. When we did, it was as if we were strangers, living in the same space but on entirely different planes of existence. Every time I saw her, the weight of what she'd done crashed down on me again, threatening to suffocate me with its heaviness. I started avoiding the house as much as I could, driving aimlessly through town, the back roads, the hills, anywhere but home. The silence there was unbearable. It wasn't just the silence of no words being spoken. It was the silence of something broken, something unsaid between us that hung thick in the air. The tension was palpable, and it felt like every time we passed each other, we tiptoed around a fragile truth that neither of us wanted to confront head-on. Memories started to haunt me, uninvited. I'd be driving past the park where we used to take walks, and I'd see her laughing at some old joke I'd made, her hair falling in soft waves over her face. Those images felt distant now, like they belonged to another couple. In another life. How had we gone from that to this? How had I let things slip so far without realizing it? One evening, after hours of aimless wandering in my truck, I found myself parked outside a small roadside diner. It was one of those old, beaten-down places that probably hadn't changed in decades. Neon lights buzzed faintly, casting a dim glow on the gravel parking lot. Inside, I could see a few regulars hunched over their meals, the kind of people who came here more for routine than food. I stepped inside, the bell on the door chiming softly as I entered. The place smelled like burnt coffee and grease, but there was something oddly comforting about it. I slid into a booth by the window, staring out into the darkness beyond. "Can I get you something, hun?" The waitress's voice brought me back to the present. She was a woman in her late 50s with a tired but kind face. Her name tag read Betty. "Just coffee," I mumbled, not really in the mood for anything more. She nodded and returned a moment later with a steaming cup, placing it gently on the table. "Rough day?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron as she stood there, eyeing me with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. I stared down at the coffee, watching the steam rise. "Something like that," I muttered. She nodded, as if she understood more than I had said. "Well, take your time. No rush." I gave her a faint nod, and she left me to my thoughts. The coffee was bitter, but it kept my hands warm, grounding me in some small way. Outside, the world seemed quiet. As if it, too, was trying to figure out what to make of my situation. I sat there for what felt like hours, going over everything in my head. The betrayal, the lies, the secrets that had unraveled the fabric of our life. And yet, no matter how much I replayed it, I still couldn't make sense of it all. How could Lana have done this? How could she have betrayed me, after everything we'd been through? But there was another question, one that gnawed at me even more. Why had I let it get this far? Why hadn't I seen the signs earlier? Had I been too blind? Too wrapped up in my own world to notice that our marriage was slipping away? Betty passed by again, refilling my cup. "You sure you don't want anything else? We got some great pie," she offered, her smile warm and genuine. I shook my head. "No, thanks. Just the coffee." She gave me a nod, her eyes lingering on me for a moment before she moved on to the next table. There was something comforting about her presence, even though she didn't know me, didn't know my story. Maybe that was the point. Sometimes it was easier to be around strangers when your world was falling apart. They didn't ask questions you didn't want to answer. As I stared into the half-empty cup, I realized that the coffee, the drive, the silence, none of it was helping me avoid the inevitable. I was running, but I didn't know where I was running to. The answers weren't out here on the road, or in the bottom of a coffee cup. They were back at the house, in the conversations we hadn't had, the truths we hadn't faced. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. I couldn't avoid it forever. I had to go back. I had to confront Lana, confront what we had become. Whether or not we could rebuild from this, I didn't know. But I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life running away from the wreckage of my marriage. With a heavy heart, I slid out of the booth and left a few bills on the table. As I turned to leave, Betty gave me a small wave. "Take care of yourself, hun," she said softly, her words carrying more weight than she probably knew. "Thanks," I said, my voice quiet. I pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool night air, the wind brushing against my face as if trying to wake me up from this nightmare. I got into the truck and started the engine, but instead of the usual sense of escape, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. I wasn't sure what was going to happen when I got home, but I knew I had to face it. I couldn't run anymore. As I drove back, the familiar streets passing by in a blur, I thought about what Lana had said, about fixing things. Rebuilding what we had lost. Could we really do that? Could I ever forgive her, or even trust her again? The house came into view, and my heart pounded in my chest. The lights were still on inside. Lana was waiting. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I pulled into the driveway, the weight of what was to come settling heavily on my shoulders. I wasn't ready for this, not really. But I didn't have a choice. It was time to stop running. I stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching beneath my boots, and made my way to the front door. As I turned the key in the lock, I paused, taking a deep breath. Whatever happened next, this was the moment. The moment that would decide the future of everything we had built together. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was time to face the truth.